You're listening to MoCast, the official podcast of Mo.gov. Whether it's news, upcoming events, or information on state services, we've got you covered. So don't forget to subscribe to us on SoundCloud. You can also find us on iTunes and wherever podcasts are found.
In this episode of MoCast, we're talking about caves and the geology, history, and exploration of them throughout Missouri. Our first guest is Jeff Crews, who is a geologist with Missouri Geological Survey. Jeff, thanks for coming in and speaking with us today.
Thanks for having me here.
And now when people either hear or see the word cave, they kind of have an image in their head already of what that is. But can you go ahead and talk about some of the characteristics of a cave?
Okay, so like you said, a lot of people have an idea of what a cave is. And what is probably unites all those is that we're talking about basically a hole in the ground or a hole in rock, and something that you can actually physically get into. And so as spelunkers and cavers, we often talk about going into caves, going into rocks, or climbing around in rocks underground. So it's that underground aspect of, a naturally occurring hole in the ground that really is pretty much a cave. And then what is actually the characteristic of the cave from there can vary wildly, just depending on where you are in the world or in the state. So
Missouri is actually recognized as the cave state. So can you talk a little bit about why that is?
This all kind of goes back to about the 1950s when organized caving and the study of caves started taking off. Missouri was actually really at the forefront as far as these state initiatives or these state speleological surveys or cave surveys were getting started. So Missouri was started one in 1955, one of the early ones, and started cataloging caves. And as these different groups throughout the country started going to conventions and meeting each other, they started talking about, well, how many caves are in your state? How many is in yours? And the people from Missouri that were doing this realized that, wow, we're kind of at the top of the list. And so there was this race to be the first state to have 5,000 caves. And Missouri was in around 4,000 or so. And so they started sending people out to try to get to 5,000. And they went ahead and contacted the governor, and they wanted a proclamation to go along with a little celebration of the 5,000th cave. And they made this initiative to be called the Missouri, the Cave State, at the same time that they got the 5,000 caves. And so that's how that came about. It was part of a cross-promotional kind of little bit of a stunt among Missouri cavers to pat themselves on the back for actually putting in the work to document and discover all these caves. What's funny is there is a letter from the Tennessee Cave Survey in our files where they saw that we had announced that we had 5,000 caves, and their letter's well, we did that months ago. We just didn't throw a party about it. So Missouri really can't claim to have the most caves of any state. And even when we got to 5,000, we technically weren't first, but we were the first state to tell everyone that we got that many caves. So
gotcha. I'm glad you cleared that up.
Yeah.
So which state has the most caves?
Oh, Tennessee.
Yeah,
it's 10,000.
Yeah. Okay. So how many caves does Missouri have?
A little over 7,000.
Okay.
And we never know the exact figures because these numbers literally change daily. Sometimes we find duplicates and the number goes down a little bit. But yeah, 7,000, 10,000 for Missouri and Tennessee. And I'm not sure where Kentucky is right now. They're really more recent, within the last 10 years, organizing a cave survey. And literally there's people with files in their basement, getting together and well, these are the caves I have and these are the caves I have, and putting a database together. And so I don't know where Kentucky is right now. It could be 9,000, it could be 7,000, somewhere around there.
So we are, I guess, one of the leading states, you would say, though?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Within the top three, always it's going to be Tennessee, Kentucky, Missouri. Someday if California gets a cave survey organized, they could probably go past us because California is a really big state and they have a lot more caves than they probably know they have. So
yeah. Can we talk a little bit about how those caves are formed and maybe why Kentucky and Tennessee and Missouri maybe have more caves than other states?
Sure. Most caves in the world are formed in rock that dissolves away in slightly acidic water or groundwater. And the rocks that actually do that are limestones, and then also another rock that's common in Missouri called dolomite. And dolomite is, most people, if they see dolomite, they'll actually call it limestone, but it's slightly different. It has more magnesium than limestone. And so when you get precipitation and you pick up carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere or organic acid acids out of soil, that slightly acidic, like acid rain, when it hits that rock, it dissolves a little bit of the rock away and slowly makes these caves. So that water moving through these limestones is what makes the caves. And so then how many caves you have is really going to come down to how much limestone or dolomite or even gypsum that you have. And Missouri is predominantly underlain by limestone south of the Missouri River and a little bit north and along the Mississippi. But almost all of the Ozarks has the potential to have caves pretty much anywhere. And then we also have really large spring systems and lots of springs. And those springs are basically caves that are forming, or even a spring could even be a cave and a spring both at the same time. And we have some of the largest springs in the United States here in Missouri as well. So all part of what we call a karst landscape. And states like Kentucky, Tennessee, even northern Alabama, northern Georgia, along the Appalachian Mountains, there's lots of limestone that's being dissolved away and forming caves. And so there's a whole region here in the middle part of the continent that has lots of caves, and Missouri's kind of right in the middle of it.
Mm-hmm. So are there different, types of caves based on, what it's formed out of?
Yeah. I mean, there's big caves and small caves, right?
Yeah.
And some caves are still hydrologically active. They have lots of water moving through them. They're, really like little underground rivers. Like if you ever go on a tour of Onondaga Cave, like you see this slowly moving stream, that is there that carved out the cave. And then other caves aren't active anymore. The streams kind of dried up, and so they're a little different. Some caves are younger and older, have more formations and or cave deposits in them. And then, in other states, you have lava tubes and things like that. There's probably lava tubes forming right now in Hawaii with the eruption. Mm-hmm. And those are caves as well. In western states where you have gypsum deposits, you have caves that are dissolved out of gypsum, and each one, as it's formed by its own little process and peculiar things, will be different. Even within the state of Missouri, we have little regions where the caves in that area have their own sort of characteristics. Like in the central Ozarks, caves are usually these big entrances along like the Current River or the 11 Point or Gasconade, and they may only go into the hillside, a few hundred feet or less, but these big spacious openings. And then if you go to St. Genevieve County or Perry County, you have these big sinkhole plains with little bitty entrances in the bottom of these sinkholes that then go into these passageways that go for miles and miles and miles in these big networks. So, and then in like Springfield area, you've got kind of a mix of both of those kind of caves, and same with like up around Columbia and like Devil's Icebox. You have sinkholes, but you also have these big river caves as well. So there just kind of depends on where you are in the state and what the nature of the rock was, how fractured it was or permeable.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned formations. Can you talk a little bit about like specific formations that are within a cave?
Oh, sure. The classic, tour guide thing is if you go in, they'll show you like water dripping off the ceiling, and the water as it moves through the rock above the cave, around the cave, it's dissolving the minerals just like water that made the cave, it dissolves out the rock that's there. But anyway, that water becomes saturated with the limestone or dolomite, and when that water hits the cave roof coming from the ceiling, it'll lose some of the carbon dioxide that's in solution, like it'll off gas a little bit, and then the mineral will start to precipitate back out of the water and form like a little rind on the ceiling. And as these drips kind of come down through the ceiling, you'll start getting what they call soda straws. If you go on a tour, you'll see these long, straight, round things hanging from the ceiling that look like a soda straw. Eventually, those soda straws will kind of clog up at the tip or in the center, and the water still wants to come down because it has like water pressure above it, and they'll start flowing around the outside of the soda straw and start growing rings around that soda straw, and that's basically how stalactites form. And the water dripping on the ground will splash and off gas more CO2, and you'll start building up calcite deposits on the floor of the cave, and that's how you get your stalagmites. That's the basic process. So if you can imagine any other way that water can come into the cave and also leave behind a mineral deposit, they'll do all kinds of other things. Like if it's kind of flowing off a ledge or something, you'll start getting these flow stones, really big canopies and drapes. If it's running down like the wall of a cave, you might start forming what they call cave bacon. One of the neatest cave formations that I think you'll see in the state of Missouri is when you have enough water pressure pushing the water like through the wall of the cave, that as the calcite starts to form, the pressure keeps pushing it, and the water droplet will get pushed in all kinds of corkscrew patterns, and you'll see what's called helictites. Just go Google helictite, and you'll see what looks like rock hair growing out of the wall of a cave, and that's probably the wildest cave formation you'll probably see around here.
Yeah, I'll have to Google that myself. That's very cool. It kind of sounds like, in a way, a cave cave is its own environment.
Oh, for sure. Mm-hmm.
So can you talk a little bit about how that environment feels and looks?
Water is the sort of story with everything with caves. So it's flowing through the cave, it's dissolving out the cave, or the water's even abandoned the cave and it's left it as almost a dry tomb. But you have like a small stream or a creek with a roof over it. And that roof and whatever the geometry the entrance is either going to let more of the outside world in or less. And depending on how deep the cave is, farther from an entrance, you get less influences from outside. So if you're near an entrance, you know, you may have lots of sticks and twigs, and the formations may all be kind of brown or gray and have lots of fungus growing on them and things like that. If you get deep in a cave, you get away from all that, and then you're like the air is a little more still, things are really quiet, you're very cut off from the outside world. About the only sounds you hear is maybe water trickling over a little waterfall or drips, and the cave life changes as you go from different zones in the cave, and depending on the size of the cave and its orientation, you just have more or less of these different kind of cave zones and different characteristics, different biology. I mean, it's all variable, and really no two caves are alike. Some caves share similarities, but each one really is different.
Yeah, it's crazy to think that there's over 7,000 caves, but yet each one is unique in its own way.
Mm-hmm.
Can we talk a little bit about some of the wildlife? I think when people think of caves, I think they automatically think of bats, but there's more than that lives there.
I mean, there are several species of bats that utilize caves. Big browns, little browns, the eastern pipistrelles, which are now called tricolors, Indiana bats, small-footed. I mean, the list of cave-dwelling bats is pretty long. But at the same time, there's at least 3 salamanders that use caves. There's cave salamanders, grotto salamanders, and there's longtail salamanders, and then there's like hybridization between the cave salamanders and the longtails. So you have these dark-sideds and like subspecies, and so there's like a whole rainbow in a way of salamanders, and that's still big stuff. When you start looking at things like cave-adapted millipedes and centipedes, it gets down to where it's really even hard to separate out species, and there's a lot of them. Cave snails, like there's essentially 3 cave snails that we know of, but there's no cave snail experts around, and they're about the small size of a sand grain.
Oh wow.
So if you find a cave snail like on a rock, all you can really say is it's a cave snail. It might be one of these 2 families, or you could be looking at a completely undescribed species and you have no idea. That's one of the amazing things about cave biology and cave life, is there's a lot that we don't know. There's a lot to be discovered. There aren't any really caves in the state that don't have cave life. They all have something living in them. Just like, Missouri is a wet state. It's not as far as not that deserts aren't alive, but they don't have the same biodiversity as like we have lots of rainfall and stuff. And we have a fairly old landscape with a lot of aquatic life and things like that, and forests and trees. And the caves also have that diversity as well. They may not have the same amount of diversity because they're nutrient limited, because the only nutrients in that cave are either being washed in by water or falling in a pit or being brought in by the bats, and so it's nutrient limited a lot of times. But other caves have big openings and have a lot of nutrient flow. They can have a lot of species richness too. So getting back to that, each cave is kind of unique thing. Each cave has its own unique biology going along with it, and characteristics of that cave really kind of control that.
Mm-hmm. So. Now, caves in Missouri, how long have they existed here?
That's a good question, right? So we have just a handful of caves that's had any like scientific study into like the age of their origin. But just as an example, there's a cave called River Bluff Cave down in Greene County. It was discovered during a road construction on 9/11. Actually, they were putting explosives like in the rock to make this road cut, and when there was a ban on all explosives nationwide because of 9/11, but they'd already put some explosives in the hole, so they had to get special permission just to blow up what they had. So they didn't do a full shot, they just blew what they had. And when they did this partial shot, they actually exposed an entrance to a cave. And the cave was about 2,000 foot long or so. Beautiful cave, big formations, no natural entrance other than this road construction. And there was preserved footprints in the cave from peccaries, which was a Pleistocene pig. Little pigs was running around in this cave during the last ice age. And anyway, they went through, some geologists, students down at Missouri State, went and did some dating techniques on different different layers of clay and sand and gravel in the cave. And the oldest date they got at the very bottom of the cave came out to just over 1 million years old.
Wow.
So that isn't necessarily the age of the cave. That is just the age of the oldest material that was deposited in the cave. The cave is like, if you took all the dirt and clay out, it'd be 20 foot tall. So it was a 20 foot tall, almost like railroad tunnel, 1 million years ago. How long did it take to get that size? That's, some people will tell you, well, it takes as long to form the cave as it does to fill it up. I don't know about all that, but at least 1 million years old for the cave to get to its current size, and then 1 million years of filling up with sediment and bones and things like that, till eventually some landslides buried the natural entrances to the cave. So
Yeah.
And kind of sealed it like a time capsule.
Yeah, that's interesting. Since they have been around for so long, how have they kind of shaped Missouri's history, or have they played a role at all?
Oh, I mean, definitely played a role. The earliest settlers to Missouri, like the Native Americans, they used the caves. They lived in them. There was their homes. Maybe not all year long, but definitely, if you imagine you're out in a new continent and it's 60,000 years ago, that may be too far back. I'm not an anthropologist, so I don't have my dates on when the first humans came down.
That's okay.
But anyway, yeah, if you can imagine, towards the end of the last ice age and it's cold out, you can either go out on the prairie or, and sleep there, or you can find a shelter. Well, these big entrance caves in central Missouri along the Ozarks were just, especially the ones that face south, perfect for camping in, living in, that sort of thing. So from the beginning of, humans even being here, the caves have been used. So then, as far as, post-contact, you had caves that had the guano deposits from the bats in them. They would actually mine out the guano, sometimes for fertilizer, like on, gardens and things. But they would also leach the saltpeter out of the guano and also out of the cave soils. And they would use that saltpeter for making gunpowder, which, in early frontier life, gunpowder was an essential thing to, fight off bears, defend yourself, or for hunting and that sort of thing. So caves were utilized then. We still find some new caves like this, but there's several caves that have been recorded to where people kept their livestock in them. There's a cave in St. James, Missouri, where half of the cave is essentially used as a barn. People are still using caves for all kinds of crazy purposes. The caves in St. Louis were used for lagering beer by the early breweries. A lot of people have heard of Limp Mansion and Cherokee Cave, and yes, if you go underneath the old Limp Brewery, you can actually find a doorway into Cherokee Cave, which was a commercial cave. Today, most caves are utilized for, recreational purposes or as a wonder or a curiosity, habitats for species. The same bats that, live in caves throughout the summer fly out every night and, eat bugs and moths over cornfields and provide a pest control role. So our lives are a little more probably intertwined with caves than we think of. Mm-hmm. We've been talking mainly about dry caves, not talking about really wet caves. And so wet, I mean, I'm actually talking about springs. We consider a spring that you can actually physically dive into to be a cave. And those are literally part of the aquifer, part of the groundwater, part of our drinking water. Those are the same springs that flows down the rivers that we enjoy and recreate on and that sort of thing. So caves, and in particular Ozark life, is pretty intertwined. Going back to my little story about the race for 5,000 caves, the Missouri Geological Survey, or the MSS, there was 3 guys that were exploring caves in the 1950s, and they didn't want to just explore them and go in them. They really wanted to study them. They wanted to understand them. They wanted to figure out why are these caves where they are, and why do they exist, and what's in them, and all these science questions. Who are we, where are we here, kind of stuff. And at the same time, the Missouri Geological Survey published a book called The Caves of Missouri by J. Harlan Bretz. Yeah, so there's these 3 guys, and they're looking through caves of Missouri, and they're realizing there's all these caves that they've been to that aren't in the book, and things they know about these caves that aren't in the book. And not that there's anything wrong with the book. It's a groundbreaking book as far as the history of study of caves go. But they knew that they knew more, and that there should be some way to organize this information and catalog it. One of these 3 guys was a guy named Jerry Vineyard, and he had worked with the Missouri Geological Survey as a student, and so he knew that they had these files and ways of organizing things, and so they decided to form the MSS, the Missouri Geological Survey, and they were able to get a handshake agreement with the state geologist to house their material at the Missouri Geological Survey. So they organized this group, and then they started organizing other cavers throughout the state, and just started compiling information and, came up with a newsletter that they could send out to all the cavers in the state that wanted to, be part of this organization. And the newsletter still exists. It's MSS Liaison. The organization's still around. Over thousands of people over the years have been part of that organization. It's still really strong. And what spun out of that organization was another organization called the Missouri Caves and Karst Conservancy. And while the MSS is all about cataloging caves and information and publishing, scientific papers and things, MCKC, the Missouri Caves and Karst Conservancy, is actually about actively purchasing or managing caves or karst resources. So they own several caves. In particular, like in Pulaski County, they own Skaggs Cave, which is like a mile-long cave, and you can get a permit to go there because there was concerns that private landowners and also agencies were not allowing people to go into caves. And so for the next generation of cavers, they realized that we need to have places for people to be able to go to learn about the resource and to enjoy it. And also there was a concern that in other places of the state that groundwater was being impacted by, development and things like that. So they wanted to be able to, purchase any other sort of land conservancy, purchase lands that they wanted to protect or preserve.
And why would you say that it's important to protect these caves?
Well, they're a resource in and of themselves that we enjoy. Kind of goes back to our roots as people coming here, came to these caves. So there's almost something a little primal about caves and why people are drawn to them. And if you still want to have them to see, then you have to protect them and preserve them as best you can. And, some of them are really pretty, beautiful formations and stuff to see. And they also contain other resources, like bats use them as habitat. It's hard to make a big convincing argument on why we need salamanders off the top of my head. Obviously, they're part of the same ecosystem as everything else, and so they have a role. I may not know what the role is, but it's there. There is, archaeological resources that's preserved in these caves. I mean, there are literally drawings and pictographs in caves. All these different resources are often found in caves, and each one of these resources has its own reason for being preserved or protected or being studied or kept around. It just so happens that these caves are often a common thread between these other resources as well. So if you protect the cave, you protect what's inside it.
Yeah. So you talked a little bit about the discovery of new caves. Is that still happening?
Oh, yeah. It's funny. People used to talk about the golden age of this or the golden age of that. Well, the golden age of caving is now. There is some wrinkles to that in that white nose syndrome has made it a little more difficult to access certain caves. There's some hoops you have to jump through to make sure your gear is decontaminated so you're not spreading the fungus that causes white nose syndrome. There's a great story. We were at an MSS meeting years ago. Someone asked the guy that kept track of our cave database, is there a place in Missouri where you can go and find new caves? And the guy said, just throw a dart at the map and go find the cave that's there. It's they're everywhere. It may not be the most amazing cave you've ever seen in your life, but there are a lot of caves still to be found. And some of them are pretty amazing. There's more than we can get done in our lifetimes. I mean, I've got a survey project where at the end of my survey line that we haven't surveyed past, the cave passage is, 30 foot tall and 200 foot wide, and it's heading off into black, and we don't know what's out there. We've got an idea, because based on some experience and what some of the other caves in the area are like, but we don't know how big that cave is. It could be 2 miles, it could be 5 miles. The longest cave in the state is around 30 miles.
Oh, wow. Which one is that?
Crevice Cave in Perryville.
Okay.
And, it literally has passages that go into towns. And then most of the cave is out underneath farms and fields and things like that.
Now, is that one that's open to the public, or how does that work?
No, the cave isn't open to the public. It's has 3 entrances, but they're all on different private properties. And so in order to access that cave or any segment of it, you need to get permission. Most of the caves, even the ones that are on public property, are technically closed, mainly because of white nose syndrome, in order to help lessen the spread. But there are lots of caves that, it takes some work to find out who it is that owns the cave and getting their permission to go there, because, the caves are sensitive. These formations and beautiful things that we talk about, they're easy to damage and break. If you spend much time going into, some caves along some more popular areas, you'll see a lot of spray paint, a lot of trash where people aren't respectful. Gaining the trust that you're not going to be one of those people that do that does take some effort and some work. But if you're willing to put that effort into meeting people that know some things about caves and being educated on how to be part of the solution, not part of the problem with caves, then it's not too hard to get access and to be part of groups that are going into caves and making big discoveries.
So that kind of leads into my next question about the options that there are for Missourians who want to explore caves.
Like I was saying, these are, a valuable resource for the people that own and manage these caves. So first of all, you need to learn how to be able to move through the cave and stay safe and things like that. So we typically recommend that someone find a club or a group of cavers. And so you get on the National Speleological Society's webpage and you can find a list of what's called grottos, which is basically a club. And you can find the one closest to you and make contacts with people and kind of see where you fit into that caving community. If that's not an option, try to read everything you can about safe caving and about the resources there and how to, minimize your impact on them. Because there's a lot of things in caves that once you impact them or damage them, there's really no repair. There are places where you can place a footprint and there was no footprint there before, and now there's a footprint and it's never going away. I mean, just like Neil Armstrong's boots, until a meteorite hits that boot print, those footprints are there on the moon. Caves are kind of the same way. There's places where, no one's ever been before, and when you're the first person there, you're going to make that impact. So educating yourself on how to minimize that impact and try to preserve as much of the cave as possible is pretty necessary. But then after that, it's, old school talking to people, talk to your neighbors, talk to your landowners. Almost everyone has a cave story somewhere, and that's really kind of where the adventure part kicks in. And then after that, you could be caving your whole life in Missouri, exploring caves here. You could be going to Mammoth Cave in Kentucky, the longest cave in the world. There's a lot of Missourians that go participate in that. You might find yourself in, Thailand. The map of Deer Cave in Borneo is drawn by a guy named Mick Sutton, and Mick Sutton lives down by Annapolis, Missouri. Missouri cavers make some of the best cave maps in the world. The MSS being an early organization that set standards on how to make cave maps and how to document caves, set off like almost an arms race of who could make the best cave maps. It's kind of crazy to think about, Missouri, which has, a lot of nice caves, but for the study and document of the caves, really some of the best cavers in the world are right here in Missouri. It's pretty amazing.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any specific cave story that you'd like to share?
Oh, I don't know.
You can think of?
There's so many.
Yeah. Have you discovered a cave yourself? I guess I'll ask that.
I mean, yeah, I've got one cave story, and some of my friends may not like the story, but I'll tell it anyway. I discovered a cave once that I thought I was the first person to discover it. Turned out I hadn't been the first person. Some friends of mine, when we were in college, we found this cave and we went into it. And it was a long, horrible crawl, laying in water, passageways that are 10 inches or so. But eventually it opened up into, this big trunk passage that was highly decorated with these amazing crystal formations and stuff on it. We were just like ecstatic, like little schoolgirls jumping up and down, finding this cave. It turned out, though, that the cave had actually the entrance had been discovered by some cavers from St. Louis a year or two previously. And they were doing something that I wasn't doing at the time, and that was that as they explored the cave, they mapped the cave as they went. If you're going to explore it, you might as well document what you explore. Unlike, seeing a mountain like Everest and being like, I want to climb the mountain, you already know what's there. You can see the mountain. You can make a map of it without being on it. Caves are different. If you want to actually document the cave, you have to go there. If you want to tell people what you've done or show people, you have to document it. So they were doing that. They were doing it the right way. I was just like a crazy college kid going into a hole in the ground. The mapping and surveying is a lot of work. It takes a lot of patience, like often laying in the water in bad conditions to like sketch and draw out the cave, and so it's slow going at times. And to get people to actually put up with all this, it's like, well, hey, we're going to a cave that's never been discovered before, and you can help us discover it and survey it. Well, if you go and you explore the cave without documenting it, we call it scooping. And so I went and actually scooped these other people's find with this great discovery I had. And then next time they go into the cave and they think they're at the farthest anyone's ever been before, well, here's marks in the ground where someone else had crawled on before. Mm-hmm. So then they started accusing each other of someone going behind the other person's back to the cave, and scooping the other people on the team, because no one was supposed to know about this cave because it had a really small entrance that was hard to find. And it turned out it was me and my buddy had done it, not anyone from their group, but eventually they decided to go ahead and just keep at it and keep documenting the cave. And they eventually went ahead and surveyed the entire cave, and it turned out to be just under a mile long total explored passageway when it was done. A few years after this all happened, we all eventually met each other and later collaborated on all kinds of other projects, and we're all great friends and all that kind of stuff now. But there was a point in time where, if they had found out who it was that had scooped their find, they'd probably been pretty mad.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's a little bit of cave politics mixed in with etiquette and discovery all wrapped into one. Kind of interesting story.
Yeah, I enjoyed that. Is there anything else that you think we might have missed that we haven't talked about, or?
There have been similar incidents has happened in Missouri as Thailand as far as people being trapped in caves. There was a group that went into Cliff Cave in 1993 in St. Louis, and the cave flooded. Most of the people that was there died. So there wasn't like an upper level passage where they could wait out the rising waters. And a similar thing happened in 1977 down by Branson but in Stone County. A cave there were 4 boys that had went to a cave, and came a big storm and it rained and it flooded the passageway they were in, and they were almost out of the cave. They were, it was a 2-mile long cave, and they were maybe 100 yards from the entrance. As far as people being trapped by floodwaters, it's a risk. Some caves like Devil's Icebox around Columbia, or the caves in St. Genevieve or Perry County, where there's these large sinkhole plains and all the water goes into the caves, are fairly flood prone. And so the cavers that explore them, they know that, and they keep their eye on forecasts, and they watch the weather, and they're pretty careful about when they go in, because those caves will flood, and they'll flood all the way to the roof. There's a few caves in the central part of the Ozarks that are that hydrologically active, but for the most part, most of the caves in the state are fairly safe from floods and that sort of thing, just due to the nature of where they are in the landscape and how hydrologically active and stuff they are. So we probably aren't going to see like an incident like Thailand happen in Missouri. Part of it's because you probably wouldn't be able to wait out a flood like that. There are 2 cavers from Missouri. They were living in Missouri at the time. They were in Kentucky, and they actually were trapped by a flood. Basically, they ended up staying in the cave an extra day that they didn't plan on, because the way they had came into the cave was a low-level stream passage, and they were up in an upper-level passage when it rained. But these things do happen. We try our best to manage that risk and minimize it, but nature does what nature wants to do sometimes, and you can get caught out. Same thing can happen with, if you're active canoeer or camping, or storms happen, and they're not always predictable either. So
I guess, are there some things to keep in mind for the general public as far as things to bring along, gear, or just like safety tips, like you said, watching the weather might help?
Yeah, always let someone that's on the outside that's not going in the cave know where you're going. We recommend taking groups of 4. That way, in case someone like twists an ankle or breaks a leg, someone can stay with them while other people go for help, because if you break a leg in a cave, someone's going to have to carry you out, and it's going to take a major effort. All cave rescues take a lot of effort, so we don't want to have a cave rescue, but if we do, you need to have people that can go get help for you. Knee pads are pretty much a must on any cave. They're not all big walking passages. You're going to have to crawl somewhere, and so you're going to need knee pads, gloves, warm clothing that keeps you warm even when you're wet, because most Missouri caves are wet at least somewhere. We're not out in the desert. It's not New Mexico. You may end up being in the cave longer than you plan. Like a twisted ankle could double the length of time you plan on being in the cave, and so having extra water, more water than you're planning on using, some food and snacks, and extra warm clothes in a pack or something like that is recommended, as you spend more time with other cavers, and you'll see what other people bring with them, and that'll kind of help guide you. Everyone has a little bit different gear. Everyone has their own personality. It's not Europe where everyone dresses in uniform when they go in caves. Make sure you have the equipment that you need and are trained and know how to use it well. A lot of caves are vertical, which means like there's pits and things. You have to use ropes to get in and out of the caves, and that's going to take an extra level of training and comfort. Hanging by a rope, over a 100-foot pit is, something that most people haven't done. So you need to prepare for that and be comfortable with the equipment and work your way up to that. Your first cave you ever go into shouldn't be some crazy deep cave that can hurt you. So
start small and work your way up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
All right. Well, for anyone who wants to learn maybe more information, where can they go to get that?
Yeah, so if you want to know more about Missouri caves, you can go to the MSS website, belio.org. If you want to learn about cave conservation, Missouri Caves and Karst Conservancy, MCKC is a good place to go. And for like the whole nationwide overview on caves and caving, the National Speleological Society is a great organization to look to for that. But if you just want to go and see some caves, Missouri State Parks has a lot of really nice show caves that you can visit. And then also, there's privately owned show caves as well, or commercial caves, where you can go on a tour. Some caves also offer wild cave tours, so you can kind of get your feet wet and see if you really like all this caving stuff, or you go out and buy a bunch of gear.
Our next guest is Roxie Campbell, who is a park naturalist with Missouri State Parks. Roxie, welcome, and thank you for coming in today.
Well, thank you for having me.
To me, I think that caves are really fascinating, but I really can't put a reason on why that is. So I'm going to turn that over to you. Why do you think that caves are such a popular attraction, especially in Missouri?
Yeah, I think they are mysterious. It's a hole in the ground, and you wonder where it goes and what's in there, and it just invites you to explore. And then when you explore, I think caves sort of keep fostering this, because you might be going through a passage that's just dark and brown, and then all of a sudden you see this white stalactite, and it's beautiful and stands out. Or you go through a small passage wondering if it's even worth doing this, and then it opens up into a room. So it rewards you with surprises and a form of nature's beauty that you don't see above ground.
Missouri has, I think, a little over 7,000 caves.
Right.
How many are those featured within Missouri State Parks?
We've inventoried and have 197 caves in Missouri State Parks. Many of those are small, or they're very remote locations. We have 4 caves where we do a lot of tours for the public. And then there are other additional caves that we sort of classify them by their risk, or by maybe animals or cultural features we're trying to protect. And based on that, some are listed as unrestricted, and you could get a permit to enter on your own if you meet the criteria. Others are closed to protect animals or features or people's safety.
One cave that I think is kind of unusual, it's actually on, I think, a historic site. It's Bothwell Lodge.
Yeah.
And it's like a mansion, I think, in Sedalia, and it was built on top of the cave because of the cooling
right. They
aspect
wanted
of
to
it.
take advantage of nature's air conditioning then, in
Yeah.
a time when there wasn't air conditioning.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's actually a little door in the mansion that opens up and lets the air from the cave in.
Mm-hmm. And so when we think about like caves being a part of history, they were used for that aspect of it, but also just in exploring caves in general, how has it played a role in how we experience them?
Yeah. Another use would be to store food, to keep things cool, like a cellar, essentially. But I think there's the entertainment aspect, because imagine growing up in the Ozarks and, there's not a lot for young people to do. And so exploring a cave with your friends would be a pretty favorite pastime for teenagers and maybe those in their 20s. And there's roots to that too, because 1800s through early 1900s at least, like let's say a Sunday afternoon, families would gather at a spring or a cave, partly because it's cool, but also it's just a great place to picnic, and probably the older people sit around and visit and the younger people go explore, and it's just sort of somewhat traditional as well.
It seems like some caves have been developed and others are left more natural. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, there have been a lot of caves in Missouri that were sort of developed for commercial, business to give tours. And so they would put in concrete walkways and railings and electric lighting. We call those commercial caves. And there's a number of them that are in business and, provide great tours. Many people enjoy seeing a cave more in the comfort of having a walkway and electric lights and railings. Others really prefer the wildness of caves because it's more of an adventure, and it's more a testing of their skills of maybe finding their way and negotiating little muddy slopes and climbing over rocks, and that's more fun to them. The park I work at has a wild cave that we used to do wild cave tours in, and people would come from all over the state and the country to experience that. And I guess the benefit of that too is we did provide a guide, and so we were sort of like a college 101 course in wild cave exploring. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what you do at Rockbridge Memorial State Park?
Yeah, I'm a park naturalist, which means I do a lot of things, from teaching people about bats in caves to taking care of natural resources, whether it be above ground, like burning off prairie areas, or in the cave counting and checking on, the bats and the pink planarians. When I interviewed at Rockbridge, a cave tour is actually part of the interview because really most important natural feature of that park is the cave. And so they wanted to make sure they had someone who was comfortable and interested in caves. And for many years, we did wild cave tours where we would take groups of 10 into Devil's Icebox Cave for 5 or 6 hours. And explore about 1.5 miles in and 1.5 miles back out. It was pretty strenuous, and you involve things like using a canoe for the first half mile. But it was sort of a unique experience in that very few places offered such a wild cave tour experience. And it's really neat to be sort of like in a wilderness underground, even though only 100 feet above you is, civilization. In fact, many people commented that it was a once-in-a-lifetime experience.
It's sort of this, I guess, unknown underworld.
Well, and the cave tours would involve, that sense of exploration, seeing the beauty of nature, but it's also sort of testing your physical abilities, and it's a social experience too, because you're doing this with a group of people. And you've probably heard mentioned that if you want to test your relationship, like a boyfriend girlfriend, you go canoeing because you have to work together, on the canoeing. Well, the cave exploring is sort of like that, you're yeah.
Yeah, I could definitely see that being the case. Can you go ahead and describe the cave system at your park, which is Connor's Cave and Devil's Icebox?
The Devil's Icebox cave system is the 7th longest cave in Missouri, with over 6.5 miles of passageways. Most of that is in Devil's Icebox Cave, but where Devil's Icebox Cave flows out, the next section we call Connor's Cave, because Connor's Cave is managed differently. It's open for people to explore on their own every day of the year. And then it flows through a spring and then through the rock bridge. So that's all part of the same system, in addition to some sinkhole pits that are out there in the park. It's really neat, I think, that at our park we have sort of something for every difficulty level, like Connor's Cave and Under the Rock Bridge are perfect for children. So we bring a lot of children's groups in, whether they be with schools or scouts, and we guide them, and it's a great experience for them.
Can you talk a little bit about some of the interesting features and wildlife within each of those?
Of course, we have our share of stalactites and stalagmites and flowstone that's sort of sprinkled here and there throughout the cave. But what is probably more special about Devil's Icebox Cave is the animal life. We have 6 species of bats, 2 of which are federally endangered species. The Indiana bat that hibernates with us, and gray bats, which are with us in the summer. It's a maternity colony, so we have a group of females that give birth to and raise their young in the cave. And in recent years, we've had about 2,000 gray bats. So it's an important, nursery colony for them. The Conservation Department's done a scoring system for caves, and we rank number 2 in biodiversity in the state. Part of this is because we have a lot of sinkholes that input water, leaves, various debris that's nutrients for animals in the cave. But aside from that, in the cave itself, animals that live there year-round, these are called troglobites, and we have 9 of those species. So they're very dependent upon a cave habitat, making it all the more important we protect the habitat for them. One of those troglobites is also endemic, meaning it only lives in Devil's Icebox Cave. That's the pink planarian. Sort of looks like an earthworm, but flatter. It's a flatworm. It's about 1 inch long, and it's either white or almost see-through. Again, troglobites, since they're in caves all the time, they don't have eyes and they don't have pigment. These can have a pink color, which is really you being able to see their intestines. But they're pretty fascinating. They're a predator in the cave ecosystem, managing to catch these faster swimming little invertebrates, isopods, amphipods. And really we don't know how they manage to catch them because they haven't been studied very much, so we don't know what sort of extra sense they have that allows them to, perceive where this critter is in the dark and be able to catch it. Even though it's just a worm, it has a brain and a nervous system, and each of them has male and female sexual organs. They create a little cocoon of eggs. It's a little red-colored ball. So, they're a very special animal, and we try to give them some special protection. Again, since this is their only known home, so if the water were to become polluted in Devil's Icebox cave stream, we could lose that species. Mm-hmm. And we have a watershed of about 8,500 acres. That's where the water comes from that flows through the cave. And we try to educate people who live in the area so that they can help protect the water quality. We have thousands of sinkholes that drain rainwater directly into the cave system. So sinkholes are like nature's drain pipes. It's sort of like below your bathroom sink. There's a pipe that carries the water away. So the water isn't getting filtered or cleaned when it's going from the land surface into the cave. And so there's a lot of potential for pollution to enter the cave in areas like this. We call this karst topography. Karst is a word that was coined to describe land that has soluble bedrock and caves and springs and rock bridges and sinkholes.
You talked a little bit about protecting the wildlife.
Mm-hmm.
So what are some of the, preventative measures that you have in place to make sure that these species are protected?
Well, we're particularly concerned for the bats because they have been dealing with a new disease for the last several years called white nose syndrome. Basically, that fungus that causes that disease is in Missouri now. So what we're trying to do at this point is prevent disturbance of bats during their winter hibernation time so that they can be stronger and hopefully survive the disease. And one thing that's rather ironic is prior to WNS, white nose syndrome, little brown bats were very common. There were millions in the country, and we had around 12 to 1,700 that would hibernate with us. But white nose syndrome has hit them really hard, so now numbers have greatly reduced. But even if we just have a few, we want to help keep those few healthy so they can survive and have young and pass on a resistance. And it's a little harder for the aquatic animals like the pink planarian because all of those 8,500 acres that drain into the cave affect them. So it's just important that landowners prevent pollution, be careful with chemicals like herbicides or pesticides or oils, or also to prevent erosion, because we found that back in 2009 we had a die-off event of the little invertebrates the pink planarians eat. Mm-hmm. And the best conclusion we could come to was that it was a very fine layer of silt on the rocks that affected the breathing apparatus of those little invertebrates and caused them to die. So just getting too much dirt in the cave mm-hmm. can be detrimental.
Wow, that's very interesting. I'm sure you've done hundreds of these cave tours for a variety of people.
I haven't kept track.
Yeah. Is there anything you've learned from that experience, whether it be the cave itself or the people who visit?
It's been interesting being a leader of a group, on a wilderness expedition into Devil's Icebox Cave, and you sort of learn to watch people's behavior and evaluate how they're doing, physically and psychologically, and adjust to that. But one of my favorite memories is from actually a fairly challenging side passage called Devil's Roost. It had a sort of a round chimney up, and then at the top there were two walls fairly close together. You would chimney down. I remember a couple of my participants were anxious about it, and they were like, I don't know if I could do this, but they were also very excited about it, and they wanted to conquer that, and they did, and they felt so exhilarated that they did it. So meeting those kind of challenges successfully is really rewarding, and they were just really stoked about it.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah. Are there any other caves throughout Missouri State Parks that you think are important to mention?
There are 3 parks with 4 caves mm-hmm. that have tours regularly throughout the summer. There's Onondaga Cave State Park. There are tours in Onondaga Cave, also in Cathedral Cave. And those do have, walkways. Onondaga has lighting system. Cathedral's a little more of a lantern kind of tour. Ozark Caverns at Lake of the Ozarks area has cave tours regularly. A nice leisurely walk, great information to learn. And also at Merrimack State Park, there's Fisher Cave, which again is a little more like Cathedral. It's sort of a in-between commercial and wild cave where you get a good feel for the cave. And
now, discussing these different caves, what makes one visit, I guess, different from another? Are they that unique, or is it kind of like once you've seen one cave, you've seen them all?
Each cave is very unique. And I think that's part of why, some people do cave exploring as a hobby. And I think that's what's almost addictive about it is it's like each cave, I haven't been to that cave yet. I don't know what it's like. And each cave is different from sort of the size and the shape. Many in Missouri are sort of linear, but then others have vertical areas. Our cave has some domes that go up like 35, 50 feet from the stream area. We have some caves that start from above ground, and there are a hole that goes straight down 30 feet, so you'd have to rappel down into. There are small little shelter caves on bluffs. Well, and then the speleothems, the stalactites and such are different. Ozark Caverns has water pouring onto these formations. Cathedral and Onondaga have some real beautiful flowstones or stalactites. Onondaga has the lily pad room, where it's like a pool of water with these, looks like lily pads floating, but they're calcite deposits. And then, of course, the occasional animal sighting, whether it be a salamander or a bat.
It sounds like a very visual experience, and here we are on a podcast with no visuals. But that's why they need to go and explore them. When people are going and visiting, is there anything that they should keep in mind as far as like what to wear or what to bring along?
Yes. Let's say you're coming to Conner's Cave to tour that on your own. You would want to, first of all, have some good footwear. You don't want to wear flip-flops because, your feet slide around, might rub against a rock and get a cut. So closed-toed shoes, tennis shoes, hiking boots. And sometimes you need some good traction. Like we have some side passages with this packed dirt clay that's slippery when it's wet. So you want some knobbies on your bottoms of your boots. What's best is to have a helmet where you can attach a headlamp to the helmet, and then wherever you look, the light is pointing there. But of course, flashlights work too. One thing to keep in mind there is to have some backups, because you don't want to have a group go in with one light and then it goes out. So each person should have a couple of lights or an extra batteries. Some people use their phones for light, but they have to remember that they're taking a risk of dropping that phone on the rocks or into the water.
Or the battery dying and then they don't have it.
Let's see. We also ask that people don't wear the same clothing they wore in one cave to another cave, just because they could be transferring that fungus of the white nose syndrome. So twice is too much. Conner's Cave is sort of a short in and out. If people wanted to do a longer wild cave tour, it would be best to become acquainted with some people who are in caving clubs. We call them grottos, and they can provide some training on, if you're going to go into a cave for 2 hours or more, you'd want to bring additional supplies and wear certain clothing that's going to keep you warm in that cool environment. And, there are some risks involved, so it's good to be educated and aware of those. As
far as any cave memories or stories, I know you mentioned one. Is there anything else that you can think of that you'd like to share?
I remember in Devil's Icebox Cave, exhilaration of going through the wade, which is water like chest deep. And then in a short distance beyond that, sitting down, and then the guide suggesting we turn around and look, and there's the waterfall, which actually isn't water, it's calcite. So it's this 25 feet high white calcite coming down the wall, sparkly and just very beautiful, again, in the otherwise brown environment. Had a lot of fun in caves, from, it's neat to negotiate the passageways, step from this rock to that rock. And
well, I guess something that I don't necessarily think about, but you think of a cave being wet, but you don't actually think about actually having to wade through, like you said, chest deep.
One of my favorite parts of Devil's Icebox Cave is the water passage, where you're in a canoe, and it's very calm water, so it's very peaceful. That's another aspect of caves. Often we would sit and just be quiet and listen to silence with little dripping water over here. We'd turn off our lights and see how dark it really is. And again, it's just a sense of being in a wilderness, just a short distance from civilization.
Mm-hmm. Now you said like the canoe trip. How do people, if they're interested in doing that, how do they go about scheduling that?
Well, unfortunately, we're not offering that right now.
Okay.
They could check back with us. We make a decision each year, usually in the spring of the year. So what we're doing is being careful to protect the bats. This is their habitat, of course. We would like to, offer the tours again someday. We'll just have to wait and see when that will be.
But there still is cave tours offered for Connors Cave, right?
Connors Cave, you can tour that on your own, and then during the summer months here, every other weekend, both on Saturday and Sunday in the afternoons, 1 to 4, people can just walk the trail and show up at Devil's Icebox, and we'll have 2 people there to provide information, loan helmets and flashlights, and then guide people into Connors Cave. It's about a 20-minute tour, sort of on a first-come, first-served basis. And then, of course, remember those other state parks that have guided tours, Onondaga, Merrimack, and Ozark Caverns. Yeah, so it's a great way to, cool off on a hot summer day and have some mystery and excitement added to your day. And don't forget the commercial caves out there. We were talking about the history of exploration, and it goes way back. Understand that Schoolcraft, one of the early explorers, visited what's now called Smallin Civil War Cave down by Springfield, and he wrote about it. And so then people are hearing these stories, reading about this mysterious cave, and they want to go experience it themselves. And there is a lot of history. Like that one, for example, Civil War soldiers used that cave regularly to, of course, people having picnics. But each cave, in addition to having its physical features being different, has a different history story as well.
Mm-hmm.
Caves are a lot of fun, and as well as being a unique natural resource of the state.
For people who are interested and want to go online and learn more about caves and exploring them, where should they go?
Well, I have a couple websites to mention. One is caves.org. That's the National Speleological Society. You could go to mostateparks.com and then choose like Merrimack State Park to learn more about Fisher Cave or these other caves and when they're giving tours. And so mostateparks.com.
Thanks for listening to this MoCast episode about caves. Want to hear more? Then be sure to subscribe to this podcast on SoundCloud or iTunes. And if there's a topic you're interested in, let us know by leaving a comment at MoGov on Facebook or Twitter.